Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Canyons of the American Southwest, a natural and human history for everyone. Presented by wildlife biologist Aaron Bott. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here today. Over to you, Aaron.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. This is something that I am deeply connected with, and I'm excited to be sharing this topic with all of you today. Specifically, we're going to be in the Colorado Plateau region of the American Southwest, which is kind of really the highlight of the entire trip that NetHab offers down into the Southwest. And without further ado, let's get into it. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the natural history there and some of the human history. But I am Aaron Bott, and I am a wildlife biologist. I've worked and lived around the Colorado Plateau as well as the Yellowstone ecosystem for a very long time, my whole life actually, and I am proud to say that I have a lot of deep family history and connection to this part of the world. My family settled along the Intermountain American West 6 generations ago. They were Mormon pioneers that came out to basically find a new land that they could establish themselves in. And specifically, my ancestors joined the Mormon Church in Scandinavia and in the British Isles. And after converting in the 1840s, they moved out west. They joined up with Brigham Young, who was the leader of the church at that time, and came out to the Colorado Plateau. And these are some pictures of my family that I can talk a little bit more about and kind of their lifestyle as I discuss the human history aspect of this landscape that I think is so fascinating and is what we're going to cover today. But before I get into that, I'd like to talk for a moment more about the Colorado Plateau and the deep history of this location. The geologic time frame that we're going to be looking at here spans hundreds of millions of years. And this satellite image has faintly drawn in the Four Corners region of the Southwest, where you can see, if you look closely at your screen, the faint line showing the border of Utah in the upper left-hand corner, adjacent with Colorado on the right-hand side of Utah. And then you have Arizona directly below Utah and New Mexico coming in to finalize that Four Corners region. And the satellite image, I think, shows a really impressive view of this unique upheaval of sedimentary rock that is concentrated in the American Southwest. And the reason why this area captivates so many people's imaginations is because of the geologic oddities that we find out there. This is red rock country. If you've never been, I'm sure you've seen pictures on calendars or photographs on screensavers of desktops of what this bizarre landscape, this Martian landscape looks like. And this is not a geologic presentation, but I will kind of talk briefly a little bit about how this particular area formed over the last several hundred million years. The world is made up of about a dozen or so tectonic plates that form the Earth's crust, and they're constantly moving around due to convection currents or heat currents on top of the Earth's plastic-like mantle. And because they're constantly floating around, the Earth's surface has changed dramatically over the millions of years that the Earth's crust has been around. And as they're floating around, they're constantly moving into different climates, different latitudes, and things are changing. So specifically here, what we recognize as the Colorado Plateau, it wasn't always in the same latitude that it is today. And in fact, in the Mesozoic period, the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the late Cretaceous period, Pangea, this large conglomerate, cohesive, massive continental formation that made up a large majority of the world's landmass was actually passing through this part of the world, was passing through the equator. And we were about 12 degrees north of the equator. And there were large equatorial wind belts, the same trade winds that actually blow through the Saharan desert today were blowing through this part of the world. And they formed what is known as a large erg, which is an ocean of sand, much like the Saharan desert. And as these sands all bunched up, they made these impressive dunes, these tremendous dunes over millions of years, from about 250 million years ago to about 145 million years ago. But ultimately, this tectonic landmass began to shift northwards, and as it shifted northwards, the climate changed, and we had this part of the world was inundated by coastal oceans, and through water dissolving minerals such as calciums and irons. They ultimately solidified a lot of these prehistoric sand dunes, and they brought in tidal waves, fluvial plains brought in sediment washing down from higher country, so that you have mud bases, you have even limestone bases at the very top of what's known as the peak of this staircase that makes up the southwest of America. And ultimately, the continental tectonic plate that forms North America's landform ultimately bumped into the Pacific tectonic plate, and through subdivision, the resulting effects were basically what we call large orogenies, or the beginning of mountain formations. And so because of the buckling of the large continental plates, we suddenly had a massive wrinkle basically in the rug of the North American continent, which elevated the Rocky Mountains, but subsequently also created a large bulge in the southwest, elevating the desert way higher than you would expect to find this historic seabed, basically. And today the Colorado Plateau ranges from about 4,000 feet above sea level to almost 13,000 feet above sea level. And then during the Pleistocene, or the Ice Age, this area was not actually covered by glaciers, but when the glaciers began to recede in the northern Rockies and in the central Rockies, very vicious flash flooding would take place through the Colorado Plateau, and essentially would incise this large bulge on the landscape, creating elaborate caverns and canyons and very alien type landscapes. So the Colorado Plateau is essentially this incredibly high, very rich rock, sedimentary rock, desert landscape. And it's pretty remarkable to consider the fact that despite being this high elevated extreme desert landscape where it gets hot in the summer, it's extremely dry most of the year, typically less than 7 inches of annual precipitation, and then cold in the winter due to the elevation, we've had humans living on the landscape for a very long time. And specifically in this part of the world, you see, you know, a lot of the typical ancestral Puebloan dwellings that we find in like Mesa Verde, or we find in Chaco Canyon, where peoples lived for many hundreds of years and created pretty impressive lives for themselves, even empires living out here in the Southwest. But specifically in Zion National Park and in Bryce Canyon National Park, you have more and more evidence of what were known as the Fremont Indian peoples living here at the same time period as those ancestral Puebloans were living further south into Arizona and over into Colorado and New Mexico. The Fremont Indian peoples are a bit of a mystery. We don't know that much about them, and they weren't here on the landscape too long ago. We're talking about 1300 AD, so several hundred years ago, and they seem to have vanished about 1500 AD, so about 500 years ago. They disappeared from the landscape. We call them the Fremont peoples because a lot of the early archaeological exploration was done around the Fremont River, which goes right through Capitol Reef National Park in central Utah. But these people were an agrarian-based people, and they left a lot of archaeological remains. Their dwellings are still visited by many peoples who are visiting the national parks today. They left behind petroglyphs, and they had a very unique kind of lifestyle that set them apart from the more popularized Ancestral Puebloans to the south and to the east. But we're not exactly sure what happened to them. They disappeared, much like the Ancestral Puebloans, perhaps because of climate changes, and agrarian practices needed to be shifted, and so the people dispersed. But when you're traveling through this part of the world, you are going to be experiencing the opportunity to learn a lot about the Fremont Indian peoples as well as the Ancestral Puebloans. Later, after the Fremont peoples disappeared, there were other groups that made their home along the Colorado Plateau, and perhaps the most well-known group of people would be the Navajo, or the Dene, as they often call themselves. The Navajo peoples live still today mostly in Arizona, where a large chunk of Arizona is set aside as a Navajo Nation reservation. So a large chunk of land is set aside there for the peoples to live on, as well as the Hopi Nation, which is kind of a different tribe, but living in the center of the Navajo reservation. But historically, the Navajo peoples lived all across the Colorado Plateau, reaching into what is today Utah, through central Utah, all the way through the borders of Colorado and down, of course, through New Mexico and Arizona. And they were really the masters of this landscape, and they subsisted off of this landscape for hundreds of years, living in harmony with the desert to a very impressive degree, until they were finally removed, unfortunately and tragically, from their native homes in the mid-1800s and forced to relocate to reservation lands, but ultimately were able to come back, and we reallocated reservation lands on the Arizona desert. But still, I think it's important for us to realize that these peoples haven't disappeared. They've had a tragic history in this part of the world, but they're still around, and some of my really close friends are Navajos. I've had the opportunity as a state wildlife biologist to work adjacent to the Navajo Indian Reservation, and we collaborate on wildlife conservation projects pretty regularly. Also sharing this landscape with the Navajo, just to the north and a little bit to the east, are the Utes. The Ute tribe, which lived primarily in the central Rockies, but spilled out into the Colorado Plateau as well. This band of Indians, this tribe of Indians, is the group that the state of Utah is named after. The Ute peoples were a montane group where they lived, again, between the high deserts and the montane foothills of the mountains, where they subsisted for many hundreds of years as both hunters and to some degree practicing agriculture. And they overlapped with the Paiute Indians in this part of the world. And the majority, again, of most of the parks and the areas that you'd be traveling if you came out to the Southwest on one of these NatHab expeditions would be primarily in Paiute company, or Paiute territory. The Paiutes were distantly related to the Ute tribe, but unfortunately they were often attacked by other neighboring tribes that were more warlike. The Paiutes primarily practiced agriculture throughout the deserts. They were not known for their domestication practices of the horse, but they did have goats, and they did a marvelous job of farming along the Fremont rivers, the Sevier rivers, and the Virgin rivers, and the Colorado River and the Green River. All of these rivers, of course, incising this arid landscape and making this marvelous desert as iconic as it is. The Paiute peoples really made their homes in Bryce Canyon National Park, Zion National Park, all along the Virgin River. These are the areas where they subsisted, and they lived again for many generations. But as all of us know, things changed, unfortunately, in the mid-1800s as Euro-Americans began to expand westward. They began to look for new lands and new opportunities, and many of them were coming straight from Europe as European immigrants, having hard lives in Europe and looking for opportunities for themselves and for their families. This promise of the American dream was very alluring, and really it began with the Mormon Exodus west. So the Mormon Church, also known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was started in 1830 by their religious leader Joseph Smith. But after being driven out from state to state, the church originally originated in upstate New York. They finally settled on what was then the frontier, which was the banks of the Mississippi River in Nauvoo, Illinois. And they were driven out of that state eventually. Joseph Smith was murdered by a mob, and the Mormon peoples, then led by Brigham Young, felt unsafe. And so they decided to expand their way westward into what was then Mexican territory, actually. So they were quite literally leaving the United States. And Brigham Young had met with trappers, famous trappers such as Jim Bridger, who was well known for having traveled through the Yellowstone country and also down through the Utah country, and had, as the first European, set his eyes upon the Great Salt Lake. And talking to Jim Bridger and other trappers, leaders of the Mormon Church, said, "Hey, we're going to go out west. We're going to find country where nobody's going to bother us." And their naivete and their ignorance just presupposed that this land would be primarily absent of any peoples, and that they would be able to move out there and make friends with their indigenous neighbors wherever possible, but they didn't suppose that there were many indigenous peoples living out in the deserts. That's just the level of ignorance that was there at the time primarily. And so people began to come into the West, and Utah, well, what we now recognize as Utah, was first settled in 1847. And my ancestors, some of the people who were photographed, and I showed you those photographs at the beginning of this presentation, were actually in those first pilgrimages out here to the West where they settled. And life, of course, out here for many Europeans and even Eastern white Americans had a pretty severe wake-up call. This is actually Salt Lake City, Utah in 1848 or 49. And if you've been to Salt Lake City, Utah recently, you will realize that things have changed a lot. But coming out here to this desert required some fortitude, some tenacity, and a lot of lifestyle changes. My family, coming from Scandinavia, were shipwrights, and they were pretty shocked, I'm sure, when they arrived out in the middle of the Colorado Plateau along the Sevier River, and they didn't have anywhere to employ their trade. And so they actually became carpenters, and they began to build ships that they would turn upside down and mount on the tops of buildings as roofs. And so if you go through central and southern Utah today, you'll find a lot of these old buildings that basically have roofs that look kind of odd, and that's because they're boats that have been turned upside down. Also, you had a lot of immigrants, Mormon immigrants from the British Isles that grew potatoes out in Ireland and even on the coast of Scotland. And they employed their trade in the West where they settled. And that's why we have a lot of potatoes growing in Idaho, where Mormon pioneers began to plant them. Now, the interactions between the indigenous peoples, the Paiute, the Navajo, and the Ute, and the Mormons was pretty interesting to begin with. There were inevitably conflicts as lifestyles and different worldviews came into being. But there were also a lot of, I think, very forgotten or uncelebrated or underappreciated heroes among both the indigenous peoples and also the early Euro-American settlers. One person that I am really impressed with is this gentleman, Jacob Hamlin. And if you're traveling on a NatHab expedition, you'll go down to Jacob's Lake and you'll pass through the different springs that are all named after Jacob Hamlin. There's Jacob Hamlin's Arch. Jacob Hamlin was a rancher and a farmer who believed that God wanted people to get along, which seems kind of like a radical thought to some people, that he took it upon himself to learn the various dialects of the different tribes and the different indigenous peoples, and he believed himself to be called as a peacemaker by God to meet with the different Euro-Americans that were struggling to understand that the land wasn't vacant, and also the frustrated indigenous peoples who were, for good reason, upset to see that strangers were moving in and taking over some of the prime lands, the rare water resources. But Jacob Hamlin, if you want to look him up and read some of his biographies, he did a lot to try and mitigate conflict wherever it was possible, which I think is admirable. And then you also had individuals, not quite on the Colorado Plateau, but just to the north, where Chief Washakie of the Eastern Shoshones worked very closely with a lot of his Euro-American neighbors to try and create peace wherever possible. And of course, we're pretty familiar with the outcomes. Ultimately, the indigenous peoples were displaced and they were put on reservations and they were treated atrociously. But I think it's important for us to also realize that there were people who were trying very hard to keep the peace. They were kind of fighting an uphill battle, a losing battle, but people who wanted they wanted relationships to work, and they wanted to try and look for the good in others, even people who were very different from themselves. Everything really began to change, though, in the West very rapidly when the Transcontinental Railroad came out. Finally, with this incredible heroic effort by primarily immigrants working on the railroad, we connected the east to the west. And in Utah, in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. And with the advent of the trains came very quick, very fast and rapid development of the West, even the arid West on the Colorado Plateau. It was around this time that we had explorers like John Wesley Powell, the one-armed Civil War veteran who later helped found the National Geographic Society, who wanted to map what was the last unknown of the continental United States. And with companions like Jacob Hamlin, who worked as one of his interpreters, and many indigenous guides, John Wesley Powell launched 2 expeditions of the Colorado River in 1869 and in 1872. This really tenacious, self-educated Civil War veteran with one arm launched down the great unknown and mapped what was then the last unknown of the contiguous United States, the Henry Mountains being perhaps the last mapped area in central Utah of all of the lower 48 states. And what a heroic and daring effort for these individuals to try and map and be cartographers of the Colorado River. Can you imagine shooting down into the unknown along a wooden dory exploring the Grand Canyon and all of its rapids. What a wild feat. And there are a couple of good books out there that you can look up. One is called Beyond the 100th Meridian, which is a fascinating account. But again, remarkable exploration taking place during this period. And then we move into the turn of the century, the age of conservation, where we had presidents like Theodore Roosevelt, who was very concerned with conserving lands for conservation. And he made this famous visit out to the West and visited the Grand Canyon. And he shared with the public a marvelous speech that I think can be summarized in just a couple lines that I have here, where looking out across the world's largest canyon, over a mile deep, he said, "Leave this as it is. You cannot improve on it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it." And that kind of foresight, I think, is remarkable, especially for his day and age, where everything seemed like it just needed to be improved. This Euro-Americanite worldview was out and about trying to improve the system without necessarily appreciating it for its diversity and its natural wonders. And shortly after the conservation movement began in the early 1900s, we began to establish national parks. So we had national parks. Sorry about that. We had the world's first national park created in 1872, which was Yellowstone National Park. But not too long after that, we began to create national parks along the Colorado Plateau. The Grand Canyon was finally made a national park in 1919. There was a lot of public pushback during this time. People didn't think that the land should be set aside. They wanted to mine it. They wanted to extract minerals from the earth, but ultimately the Grand Canyon was protected. In that same year, a few months later, Zion National Park was also protected as the first national park in Utah. And then a little bit later, Bryce Canyon National Park, this crazy, bizarre landscape full of hoodoos at the very top of what we call the Grand Staircase, the geological formation of the Colorado Plateau at 10,000 feet of elevation. It particularly is this area of the world. And it was created in 1928. Again, a remarkable place for people to go and explore and appreciate just how wonderful this world is. And of course, with the advent of the train coming into the area, and with the national parks being created, and with the National Forest Service being spurred by Theodore Roosevelt, all of these wonderful things came together, and it wasn't long before we had what was called the showing loop of Cedar Breaks and the national parks of southern Utah. And this is pretty fun to share, this map, this vintage Union Pacific Railroad map, because it is ultimately the same map that you will go on if you choose to go on one of the NatHab expeditions down into the canyons of the Southwest. Essentially, you begin in St. George National Park. You work your way up over Cedar City, drop down through Bryce Canyon National Park, then Zion National Park, and then work your way on down to Grand Canyon National Park. This really remarkable story of human existence on the natural landscape that continues to this day as millions of people continue to travel out here to just appreciate the wonders and the beauty of nature. And of course, we have to kind of wrap up by talking briefly about some of the incredible animals that can be found on this landscape as well. These animals are incredible for having adapted for their extremely arid and high elevation environments. Everything from the eastern collared lizard to the ringtail to, of course, the Great Basin rattlesnakes and the ravens, to some of the more well-known or charismatic species such as coyotes, which range across the desert. You can hear them howling at night, to the incredible speed goat, the pronghorn antelope, such a bizarre animal, the second fastest land animal on the planet after the cheetah. And I think it surprises people to know that we have robust populations of black bears throughout much of this area as well. And we have, of course, the endemic and endangered Utah prairie dog, which is found just outside of Bryce Canyon National Park. And again, some more of our charismatic megafauna that we have on the landscape. Mule deer ranging across the deserts, mountain lions being the apex predator of this very remarkable landscape. And some of my favorite critters out there, the desert bighorn sheep, which before any famous rock climber came along and ran up Angel's Landing or ran up the north face of Half Dome or anything like that, we had these incredible natural athletes climbing on the cliffs. I think it also surprises people to realize that we have bison out here as well. Historically, we had some small bison herds. Now we have some controversial bison herds on the north range of the Grand Canyon. And then we have bison herds in the Henry Mountains. Native bison herds were extirpated, but in the 1940s, we got some genetically pure bison from Yellowstone, and we brought them down and released them into some areas of Utah where they range. Some incredible conservation stories, like with the California condor, which can be seen along the Grand Canyon and also in Zion National Park. There are also large Rocky Mountain elk found throughout this part of the world, and they're appreciated for their dynamic contribution to the landscape. And I think one of the coolest critters out there, we have beavers. We also have otters in our river systems too, but beavers being true environmental engineers trying to keep as much water on the landscape as possible. And with that, I will conclude and say that the American Southwest, the Colorado Plateau, is an incredible place. It's a place that I've grown up and lived and worked for a lot of my life. This is a picture I took not far from my home. Just such a remarkable and alien landscape with so much history, so much natural history, which you can feel when you see the rocks and you explore the terrain, but also a lot of current history. Within the last couple of 100 years, a lot of human appreciation of this landscape, a lot of draw, and it's no wonder that NatHab offers trips out there. So I hope that you can all go and explore and enjoy it for yourselves.
All right, thank you so much. Now, before we get into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So Aaron, can you talk a little bit more about what makes the bison herds controversial?
Yeah, so bison on the northern part of the Grand Canyon over on the Kaibab Plateau are arguably not native, but during the turn of the century, there's a gentleman who was by the name of Buffalo Jones. He actually helped to start the buffalo recovery program in Yellowstone National Park. He decided to bring some bison down to the northern part of Grand Canyon National Park. And the bison are there today, but a lot of biologists are concerned that they might be out competing some of the native species there on the northern part of the Grand Canyon. So while bison lived in the tens of millions across North America, there were some places where they did not historically live and they now are living. And one of those places is the northern part of the Grand Canyon.
All right, thank you. Now, one of the questions that we had was, were any of your relatives, did they join the Mormon Battalion of the U.S. Army that ended up in California?
So my family did participate in the Mormon Battalion. So very quickly when the Mormons came out to Utah, they got roped up with the Mexican War, which was taking place at that time. And a battalion of Mormons was sent toward present-day California, and they actually settled in what is today Las Vegas. So Las Vegas was settled by Mormons, and down in San Bernardino, California was settled by Mormons. My family did not make it that far to the west, but that's fun that somebody knew that.
Another question about the Mormons. In the 1850s, there was something called the Mountain Meadow Massacre. One of our guests actually learned that they had a relative, an ancestor who was a part of that. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I know a lot about that. And it's kind of it's a tragedy. It's a horrific tragedy. And I don't think that this is going to be an adequate answer. We just don't have enough time to talk about this. But in the 1800s, a group of non-Mormon pioneers were crossing the Utah territory at the time, and a group of local Mormons who were very xenophobic and afraid of controversy with non-Mormons passing through ended up attacking this non-Mormon group of pioneers and killing them all at a place called Mountain Meadows, which unfortunately is tied to Jacob Hamlin, not because Jacob Hamlin, the gentleman I mentioned earlier, was there. He was actually up in Salt Lake at the time, but it was on his property when this massacre took place. And to put things into perspective, the Mormons were living in Missouri prior to moving to Illinois when the governor of Missouri issued an extermination order on the Mormons. And it was legal to shoot a Mormon on sight. And Mormons were killed and murdered in Missouri. And when they fled Missouri, they went to Nauvoo, where mobs tarred and feathered them and killed people there as well. And so this hysteria of fear drove the Mormon community to do horrible things strictly out of fear by attacking an innocent group of pioneers traveling westward and killing them. And again, this just goes to show the kind of horrors of misunderstanding and xenophobia and not being compassionate and kind of what happens there. So a really, really tragic story that I just briefly summarized.
Well, thank you for addressing that. So, do you know what the latest best theory is as to why the cliff-dwelling civilizations faded away?
Some I do know some, but I'm not an archaeologist or an anthropologist. But some people argued, some anthropologists argued that neighboring tribes became more competitive and more aggressive. When climate situations began to change, there were spells of aridity that dried up the crops. There also is probably a lack of resources as the peoples began to exploit more and more of the timber, which is rare and valuable in the area. They could only develop their civilization to a certain point, their dwellings to a certain point before they began to run out of those resources. Climate probably played a big role in all of the above. So I think that the more well-regarded and commonly accepted theory is that as the climate changed, people shifted their movements. They had to adapt with the change as well, and that's, to my understanding, some of the more recent and up-to-date theories.
Great, thank you. So, do you know how fast the pronghorn deer can run?
Yeah, they can run over 60 miles an hour, up to 65, some people argue, but the pronghorn antelope are not true antelope. They are the last remnant of a variety of animal that existed in North America during the Pleistocene. And we used to have a North American cheetah. And through probably convergent evolution, the pronghorn evolved to run so fast to escape this apex North American predator, the cheetah. But times have changed, obviously. We don't have native North American cheetahs anymore. And the cousins of the pronghorn that also I'm sure were very quick have died out. And we're left with this really remarkable really bizarre species with horns on its head, but they shed their horns every year, just like their antlers. They can run super fast. They have great binocular vision. They're just cool critters.
Can you tell us a little bit about the ringtail?
Not as much as I wish I could. So ringtails are found throughout the Colorado Plateau, but they're hard to find, and because of that, it's rare to see one. You can find them around Zion National Park. They're omnivores, so they can, like a raccoon, they can live off of meat and berries and forbs and other plants. But they're secretive, and primarily they come out at night. They're more nocturnal. So you could be lucky and see one on your trip to the Southwest.
All right. Well, Aaron, thanks for addressing all these questions. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we do have for today. So I'm going to throw it back to you for your closing comments.
Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Again, I hope you have an opportunity to get out and explore the Southwest. The Colorado Plateau is just such a really neat place to be. The landscape is stunning. I think most people go out there and they, on the NatHab expedition, they say that they want to see the Grand Canyon because it's on their bucket list. But by the end of the trip, I'm always thrilled to hear that people fell in love with other unexpected places, perhaps even more than the Grand Canyon. Not that it's a competition, but I think there's some other amazing country out there that people are just less aware of, and it's truly a cool place to go. So thanks very much.
Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. You can join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.